The war room of the Verithan Imperial Command vessel was quiet the way a knife is quiet, still, cold, and ready. High Warlord Sethrak Ven stood at the center of the room, his 6 fingers locked behind his back, his pale yellow eyes moving across the star map that glowed in the air in front of him. He had been in this position before. He had stood in front of star maps and watched empires fall. He had never stood on the losing side. Around him, 50 officers moved through their tasks with the calm confidence of people who had never truly lost. The Verithan had not lost a major engagement in 1100 years. They had absorbed worlds the way a river absorbs rain, naturally, completely, without effort. Sethrak Ven believed this was not luck. It was destiny. It was the natural order of the galaxy, and he was its instrument. The destination marked on the map was a small cluster of star systems at the far edge of explored space. Unremarkable systems. Rocky planets. One with a thin breathable atmosphere and a species that had only reached the stars within the last 2 centuries. The species called itself human. Sethrak Ven had reviewed the intelligence files twice and found them almost too boring to finish. Short-lived creatures. Emotional. Prone to fighting among themselves. Their fastest ships were slow by Imperial standards. Their weapons were primitive. Their one notable quality was that they were stubborn, but stubbornness was not a strategy. 14 months ago, the Empire had delivered its standard ultimatum to the human home world. The terms were simple: accept Imperial authority, surrender control of your fleet and your outer colonies, and your species will be permitted to continue existing as a subject people. It was a generous offer. Most species wept with relief when they received it. The humans had said nothing. No response. No counteroffer. No plea. Just silence. Sethrak Ven had interpreted that silence as fear. He had seen it before. Some species simply froze when confronted with the reality of the Empire. They could not bring themselves to answer because answering made it real. He had given them 14 months. Enough time to process. Enough time to despair. Now he was coming to collect. Ambassador Lyrian was not in the war room. She had been removed from the planning sessions 3 months ago after her 5th attempt to argue against the operation. She stood instead in a narrow corridor 2 levels below, watching the stars through a small porthole as they bent and stretched into white lines while the ship moved through faster than light travel. She pressed one hand flat against the cold metal wall and said nothing. She had studied humans for 11 years. She had lived among them for 2 of those years, in a city on their eastern continent, eating their food and learning their languages and watching the way they moved through the world. She had read their history books. She had watched their old war films. She had spoken to their veterans and their scientists and their grandmothers. She knew what the Empire was walking into, and she had said so, repeatedly, to anyone who would listen. Nobody had listened. The thing that frightened Lyrian was not the human weapons or the human ships. She did not actually know the details of those, and neither did the Empire's intelligence services, which was itself a warning sign that everyone had ignored. What frightened her was simpler than that. It was something she had seen in the eyes of a human woman during a conversation about history, years ago. The woman had been talking about a war from several centuries past, a terrible war on their own planet, and she had said something that Lyrian had never been able to forget. She had said, "We are very slow to anger, but once we are, we do not stop. We do not know how to stop." Lyrian had filed that observation in her reports. It had been classified as a cultural curiosity and filed away. On the other side of the galaxy, in the cold dark between star systems, a fleet was waiting. Admiral Leon Graves had not slept in 31 hours. This was not unusual for him. He was 64 years old and had spent the last 20 years building toward a single moment. Sleep had always felt like a luxury he had not yet earned. He stood at the observation window at the front of the command deck and looked out at his fleet. 300 ships. They floated in the dark like a city without lights, invisible to any sensor the Verithan had ever deployed, hidden behind a screen of interference technology that a team of engineers in Auckland had spent 9 years developing. He had memorized the name of every engineer on that team. Captain Dana Holloway came to stand beside him. She was 41, with short dark hair and the kind of face that showed nothing she did not want it to show. She had commanded ships for 12 years. She had fought in 2 border skirmishes with Verithan scout vessels, small ugly affairs in the outer colonies, the kind of fights that never made the history books but left marks anyway. She looked at the fleet with the expression of someone checking that everything they packed for a long journey was still in the bag. "They are 20 minutes out," she said. Leon nodded. He already knew. He had been watching the sensor feed. The Verithan fleet was coming in fast and casual, which told him everything he needed to know about their expectations. They were not approaching for a battle. They were approaching for a formality. "How many of ours do you think we lose today?" Dana asked. She was not asking because she was afraid. She was asking because she was the kind of commander who looked at hard things directly. Leon was quiet for a long moment. "Some," he said. "We will lose some." She nodded once and said nothing more about it. Below them, across 300 ships, crews were moving to battle stations. Young men and women checking screens and running final diagnostics and talking to each other in low voices. Lieutenant Cole Ferris sat at the weapons console aboard Dana's ship, the same ship Leon was on, and his hands were perfectly still on the controls and his face was composed, and only someone who knew him well would have noticed that he had not blinked in almost a full minute. He was 26 years old. He had grown up knowing this day was coming. His mother had told him about it when he was 7, the day a Verithan vessel glassed the colony on Cal-Livan 3 and the Empire described it as a navigational error. His mother had said, "Remember this." He had. Every day since. The Verithan fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel. For a half-second, there was nothing but the hiss of re-entry into normal space and the glow of 300 alien ships filling the dark ahead of them. Then the human fleet powered on. Every ship at once. 300 points of light coming alive in the void. Weapons arrays rising. Shields engaging. Engines at full readiness. The darkness that had hidden them for 14 months dissolving in an instant, replaced by something the Verithan Empire had never seen before and was not prepared for. On the Verithan command ship, every officer on the bridge stopped what they were doing. Sethrak Ven turned slowly from his map and looked at the forward screen. He looked for a long time. Nobody spoke. For a few seconds, the Verithan bridge was the quietest place in the known galaxy. The officers stood exactly where they had been standing when the lights came on outside. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The forward screen showed a wall of ships, 300 human vessels burning alive in the dark, weapons hot, shields up, filling every quadrant of the display with something that should not have been there. Fleet Consul Drath was the first to find his voice. He asked the sensor officer for a count. The sensor officer gave it to him. Drath asked again, quietly, because he thought he had misheard. The officer gave him the same number. High Warlord Sethrak Ven turned away from the screen and clasped his hands behind his back. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that it was a bluff. He said the ships were salvage, stolen hulls, a desperate display from a species too frightened to fight and too proud to surrender. He said their weapons arrays would not fire. He said the whole thing would fall apart the moment his fleet moved forward. Drath looked at the screen and said nothing. He was running numbers in his head. The configuration of the human ships was wrong in a way that was hard to explain. Imperial intelligence had described human warships as medium-range vessels with limited shielding and conventional rail-based weapons. These ships were something else. The geometry of them was different. The placement of the weapons arrays was different. The way they held position in perfect formation without a single drift or wobble was different. He did not say any of this aloud. Sethrak Ven was not in a mood to hear it. Then a voice came over the open communication channel. It came in High Verithan, which was itself a shock. High Verithan was a complex language that took most species decades to learn, if they learned it at all. The voice spoke it without an accent and without hesitation, and every word was clear and precise and completely calm. The voice belonged to Dr. Nora Velasquez. She stood at the communications console aboard the human flagship and spoke into the channel with the steady, measured tone of someone reading a legal document. She said that the Verithan Empire had delivered an ultimatum to the human home world 14 months ago. She said that humanity had received it, had read it carefully, and had chosen to decline. Then she said something that made Fleet Consul Drath reach out and grip the edge of his console. She said, 63 years ago, a Verithan exploration vessel made contact with a small human colony on the frontier moon of Calliven 3. The colonists came out to meet the vessel. They brought food and music, because that is what human beings do when they meet strangers, they offer them something. The Verithan crew destroyed the colony from orbit and filed a navigational accident report with the Imperial Survey Office. 412 people died. Their names are in our records. We have never forgotten them. We do not forget. She paused. Then she said, humanity is giving the Verithan fleet 40 seconds to withdraw. After 40 seconds, we will assume you have chosen to stay. If you stay, we will treat that as an act of war and respond accordingly. The choice is yours. The clock starts now. The channel stayed open. The countdown began on both sides, on the human fleet's displays and, whether they admitted it or not, in the minds of every officer standing on the Verithan bridge. Ambassador Lyrian was still in the corridor below the bridge when the message came through the ship's general audio system. She had not been given access to the bridge feed, but she could hear the broadcast echo through the walls. She closed her eyes and put her back against the cold metal and slid down until she was sitting on the floor. She had written about Calliven 3 in her very first report 11 years ago. She had flagged it as a critical wound in human cultural memory, a defining event that shaped the entire species' understanding of the Verithan. The report had been categorized and archived. She wondered if anyone had ever opened it. On the human flagship, Admiral Leon Graves stood at the observation window and watched the Verithan fleet. He was counting too. Not the seconds, he already knew how the seconds would end. He was counting something else. He was counting the years. 20 years since he had first proposed this plan to a small group of military strategists in a windowless room. 18 years since the first secret shipyards had broken ground in the asteroid belt. 15 years since the first new warship came online. 14 years of building and testing and training and waiting and keeping the whole thing invisible to the most powerful intelligence apparatus in the known galaxy. Thousands of engineers and soldiers and scientists who had kept the secret, who had sacrificed promotions and visibility and ordinary lives to be part of something that had no name in any official record. Captain Dana Holloway was watching the clock on her console. She was standing straight, both hands loose at her sides, breathing slowly. She had made her peace with today a long time ago. She was not afraid. She was not angry. She was something harder than either of those things. She was ready. 30 seconds. Lieutenant Cole Ferris had his hands on the weapons console. His palms were dry. He had expected them to be sweating. He had always imagined his palms would be sweating if this moment ever actually came, but they were dry and still, and he felt a strange clarity that he had never felt before. He thought briefly about Calliven 3, about the colony his grandmother had nearly moved to before she changed her mind at the last minute and stayed on Earth. He thought about how different everything would be if she had made the other choice. Then he stopped thinking about it and watched the clock. 20 seconds. On the Verithan bridge, two junior officers quietly moved toward the exit. Sethrak Ven did not stop them and did not look at them. He was staring at the screen. The human fleet had not moved. It was holding position with the patience of something that had already decided what it was going to do. Drath spoke one more time. He said, very quietly, that the numbers did not work. He said that in every scenario, in every tactical model he had run in his head in the last 3 minutes, the outcome was the same. He said that the warlord should consider the withdrawal. He said it not as a challenge but as a simple observation, the way a navigator might point out a rock in the water ahead. Sethrak Ven turned to look at him. His yellow eyes were flat and cold. He said that 3,000 years of empire did not withdraw before a species that had been using fire for less than 100,000 years. He said the fleet would advance. He said it would be over quickly. 10 seconds. 5. On the Verithan ship, weapons arrays powered up. The sound of charging systems ran through the hull like a low humming that everyone on the bridge could feel in their teeth. The clock hit 0. Dana Holloway turned to Cole Ferris at the weapons console. She looked at him for exactly 1 second and then she said the word. Fire. Cole's hands moved. 300 human ships moved with them. The dark between the fleets lit up like a second sun being born, and the battle that would change the shape of the galaxy forever had begun. The first thing Sethrak Ven noticed was that the human weapons hit harder than they should have. He had expected the standard physics. Weapons have range, and beyond that range they lose power. Every species in the Empire's long history had operated under that same law. The humans fired from a distance that should have reduced their shots to harmless interference. Instead, the beams that crossed that distance arrived with full force, and they cut through Verithan shielding the way a hot blade cuts through ice, not breaking it, not pushing it, just going straight through. 2 ships on the outer edge of the Verithan formation were burning within the first 90 seconds. Not damaged. Not crippled. Burning, from the inside out, the way a ship burns when something has gone through its core and left nothing functional behind. Sethrak Ven stood very still at the center of the bridge and watched the screen and did not speak. Somewhere deep in his chest, something that was not quite fear but was closely related to it had begun to move. The human fleet was not moving the way it should. Imperial doctrine described human tactical formations as rigid and predictable, straight lines, simple geometry, the patterns of a species that had only recently learned to fight in space. What was happening on the screen looked nothing like that. The human ships were moving in shifting groups, breaking apart and reforming, flowing around each other like water around rocks. When the Verithan targeting computers locked onto a ship, it was not there anymore. When they adjusted, the human formation had already changed again. It was as if the humans had studied every Imperial tactic, mapped every predictable Imperial response, and built a system specifically designed to make those responses useless. Because that was exactly what they had done. On the human flagship, Chief Engineer Otto Baines was not on the bridge. He was 3 decks below in the engine room, a large man with grease on his forearms and gray in his hair, moving between consoles with the focused calm of someone who had been in bad situations before and had learned that panic used up energy you needed for other things. The ship had taken 2 hits in the first pass, glancing blows, nothing structural, but the power grid on the port side had stuttered and the shielding on that flank had dropped to 60%. He was already fixing it. "Talk to me," he said to his team without looking up from the panel he was working on. His team talked. They told him what was offline and what was close to offline and what was holding but not for long. He listened and gave instructions and moved to the next console. Around him, 4 engineers were doing the same thing in different corners of the room. They had rehearsed this. They had run simulations of exactly this kind of cascading damage so many times that the drill had become instinct. The ship was getting hit. The ship was staying alive. Above him, on the bridge, the battle was changing shape. The Verithan fleet was trying to concentrate its fire on the human flagship, which was the largest and most visible ship in the human formation. It was the obvious target. Leon Graves had anticipated this. The flagship had extra shielding and extra hull reinforcement, but more importantly, it had a position in the center of the human formation that made concentrated fire on it extremely costly. Any Verithan ship that tried to line up a clean shot exposed its own flank to 3 or 4 human ships at once. Dana Holloway was watching the tactical display and making small adjustments. She was not dramatic about it. She would point at something, say a number or a name, and the ship would respond. She had been commanding vessels long enough that the process felt like thinking out loud. Lieutenant Cole Ferris was at the weapons console and his hands were moving constantly. He had been trained for this. He had run this exact engagement in simulators 400 times. The difference between the simulator and the real thing, he was discovering, was the sound. The simulator had sounds, of course, but they were not the same as the sound of the ship actually being struck, the deep, heavy knock of energy hitting the hull, a sound that you felt in your spine more than you heard with your ears. Every time it happened, his jaw tightened. He did not stop working. Then the display showed 2 blinking symbols and his hands stopped moving for just a moment. 2 ships. Hull identifiers 7 and 23. Gone. He stared at the symbols for 1 full second before his training brought his hands back to the console. 7 was the carrier vessel Dunmore. 23 was the scout ship called the Grey Line. He knew people on both of those ships. He had eaten dinner with the weapons officer on the Dunmore 3 days ago, a quiet man from Tennessee named Calvin who had told him about his daughter starting school that year. He had played cards with the navigator of the Grey Line 6 months ago during a training exercise. A woman named Priya from coastal Georgia who kept a photograph of her family's house taped to the inside of her locker because she said it reminded her what she was doing all of this for. Dana saw his hands stop. She did not pretend she had not seen it. She crossed the bridge and stood beside him and said, quietly but without softness, that grief was real and it was right, and it had a time and a place, and this was not it. He could carry it. He had to carry it. But right now the people on the ships that were still alive needed him to keep working. Cole looked at the screen. He looked at the 2 blinking symbols. Then he looked at the 300-2 symbols that were still moving. Yes, Captain, he said, and his hands moved again. On the Verithan command ship, Fleet Consul Drath had stopped giving orders. He was standing at the tactical station and running numbers, and his face was doing something that the officers around him had never seen it do before. It was the face of a person who has understood something that they did not want to understand. He turned to Sethrakven. He said, with the measured and precise tone of a man choosing every word carefully, that he had run every possible tactical response to the current situation. He said he had considered withdrawal, counterattack, flanking, concentrated fire, split formation, and 7 other options. He said that in every single one of those scenarios, the mathematical outcome was the same. He said the humans were not winning because they got lucky. He said the humans were winning because they had built this engagement specifically to beat the Empire, from the ground up, with full knowledge of every tactic the Empire used. Sethrakven looked at him and said nothing. Drath said, "We are not going to win this. We are not going to come close to winning this. The only question is what happens next." The warlord's yellow eyes were hard and flat. He turned back to the screen. Outside, his fleet was burning. The human ships moved through the fire like they had been born in it, calm and precise, doing exactly what they had come here to do. He still could not fully believe it. 3,000 years. 400 star systems. Hundreds of species brought under the Empire's hand. And now this. A species that had only just learned to reach the stars, standing in the dark, taking everything the Empire could throw at them and answering back twice as hard. He had called them primitive. He was beginning to understand what that word actually meant, and what it did not. The Verithan line broke in the 4th hour of the battle. It did not break all at once. It broke the way a old wall breaks, quietly at first, 1 stone at a time, and then all at once when the weight became too much. A group of 6 ships on the eastern flank turned and ran. Then 12 more on the northern edge. Then the center began to pull back, not in retreat formation but in the scattered, uneven way of ships whose commanders had stopped following orders and started listening to their own survival instincts. In 20 minutes, what had been an organized Verithan fleet became a collection of individual ships all trying to get somewhere else as fast as their engines would carry them. The human fleet could have destroyed every single one of them. Leon Graves gave a different order. He said, "Disable engines and communications on withdrawing vessels. Do not destroy them unless they turn and re-engage." He said it once, over the fleet-wide channel, in the same calm voice he used for every other order. There was a pause, not long, maybe 2 seconds, before the acknowledgement started coming back from his ship commanders. He heard the pause and understood what it meant. His commanders were professionals. They accepted the order. But they had also lost people today, and some part of them wanted something other than restraint. Dana Holloway was one of the people who paused. She looked at Leon after the order went out and she said, quietly, that some of those ships would make it back to Imperial space and report what they saw. The Empire would send more. Leon said yes. They would report exactly what they saw. That was the point. He said the galaxy was full of species that had watched the Verithan operate for 3,000 years and learned that conquest was how power worked. He said he wanted those retreating ships to carry a different lesson home. He wanted the Empire's own officers to walk into the Imperial capital and tell the High Council what happened today and what humanity had chosen to do when it had the chance to do anything. Dana looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Understood, Admiral." And she turned back to the tactical display and got back to work. In the corridor below the bridge, a door to a secondary communications room opened and Ambassador Lyrian moved quickly to the terminal inside. She had been waiting for a gap in the ship's security monitoring cycle. She had studied Verithan command vessel protocols for years and she knew there was a 40-second window every 11 minutes when the internal sensors cycled. She sat down, entered a frequency she had memorized years ago, and opened a channel. Nora Velasquez received the signal on the human fleet's communication array. It was flagged as a low-power transmission on a civilian frequency, coming from the Verithan command vessel. She almost filtered it out. Something made her listen instead. She put on her earpiece and heard a voice she recognized. She had studied recordings of Verithan diplomatic communications for years, speaking in a dialect of High Verithan used only in private correspondence. The voice said, "My name is Lyrian. I was the Empire's ambassador to Earth for 2 years. I know what today has cost you. I know what Callivan 3 meant. I know what the Empire did, and I know that I could not stop them, and I am sorry. I have been sorry for 63 years. I am contacting you because I need to know if there is anything left to talk about. I need to know if humanity wants a war that ends the Empire, or a peace that changes it. Either answer is fair. I just need to know." The transmission ended. Nora sat for a moment, then took off her earpiece and went to find the Admiral. Leon listened to the recording twice without moving. When it ended the second time, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he asked Nora what she thought. She said she had studied Verithan vocal patterns and stress indicators for years. She said that everything in Lyrian's voice was consistent with someone telling the truth about something painful. She said she believed her. Leon nodded slowly. He said, "Open a channel back. Let her talk." On the Verithan command vessel, the situation had become something simpler and uglier than a battle. The remaining functional ships were either trying to flee or broadcasting surrender signals. Sethrak Ven was still on the bridge, but the bridge around him had changed. Half his officers were working on damage control. The other half were quietly doing nothing, watching him, waiting to see what a man like him did when the world he had always believed in stopped being true. He had decided to answer one last question for himself. He moved to the weapons console and began entering the commands for a full-power ram trajectory aimed directly at the human flagship. If his ship was going to be the last thing in this battle, he decided it would end in motion. He decided it would end as a statement. No species that had just beaten him in open combat would be allowed to walk away thinking they had beaten him completely. He got as far as entering the coordinates before Fleet Consul Drath stepped in front of the console. Drath was not a large man. He was not a loud man. He was an older officer with careful eyes and a reputation for being the most precise tactical mind in the Verithan fleet. He looked at Sethrak Ven and said, in a very quiet voice, that the warlord's decision to die here was his own. He said that the warlord did not have the right to make that decision for 5,000 people. He said that the crew of this ship had followed every order and fought without hesitation and had done nothing to deserve being used as a weapon for the warlord's personal sense of honor. Sethrak Ven hit him. It was a hard blow, the kind meant to end a conversation by force. Drath stepped back, absorbing it, and then stepped forward again and put himself back in front of the console. He did not hit back. He just stood there, with a bruise forming on the side of his face, and held his position. Then he reached past the warlord and began broadcasting a surrender signal. Sethrak Ven did not stop him. Whatever had held the warlord together for the last 4 hours seemed to leave him all at once. He stepped back from the console and stood very still, and the officers on the bridge pretended not to look at him, and the surrender signal went out across the dark. Aboard the human flagship, Cole Ferris saw the surrender signal register on his display. He reported it to Dana in a steady voice. She acknowledged it and passed it to Leon. Leon told the fleet to hold position and stand down from active engagement. The order went out. The guns went quiet. The battle was over. Cole sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long moment. His hands were still. The ship around him was still making sounds, the sounds of systems cooling down, of engineers moving through damaged sections, of the ordinary machine noise of a warship that had been through something hard, but it felt quiet in a way that nothing had felt quiet in hours. He thought about Calvin from the Dunmore. He thought about Priya from the Grey Line. He thought about his grandmother who had almost moved to Callivan 3 and had changed her mind at the last moment. He thought about all the people who had built these ships in secret, who had spent years of their lives making today possible. He thought about the weight of it. Then he got up and went to help the damage control team, because that was what you did next. The guns were quiet. The dark was full of wreckage. Leon Graves stood at the observation window again, in the same spot where he had stood before the battle began, and looked out at what was left. Pieces of Verithan ships turned slowly in the distance, catching the light of the nearest star and throwing it back in long, dull glints. The surrendered command vessel sat still and dark at the center of it all, broadcasting its signal, waiting to see what came next. The human fleet held its position around the wreckage like a hand that had just closed but had not yet opened again. He had been standing there for about 20 minutes when Dana came to stand beside him. She did not say anything at first. She looked out at the same things he was looking at and seemed to be doing the same kind of accounting he had been doing, not tactical, not logistical, just the human kind. The kind where you add up what the day cost and try to understand the total. What happens now? She asked. Leon said the Empire had a choice. They could come back with everything they had, and humanity would be ready. The shipyards were still running. The engineers who had built this fleet could build another one if they had to. Or the Empire could choose to talk. He said he genuinely did not know which one they would pick. 3,000 years of doing things one way left very deep marks on a civilization. It was hard to change direction when every memory and tradition and institution pointed the same way. Dana asked which one he hoped for. He said he hoped they talked. He said it simply, without drama, the way a man states something he has believed for a long time and has never needed to perform for anyone. She nodded. She did not say she agreed or disagreed. She had spent her career in the places where hope met reality, and she had learned not to argue with either one. She just stood there beside him for a little while, two people looking out at a changed galaxy, and then she went back to work because there was still a great deal to do. 2 decks below, in a small crew lounge that smelled like coffee and recycled air, Lieutenant Cole Ferris sat alone at a table in the corner. There was a cup of coffee beside him that had gone cold an hour ago. He had not touched it. In his hands was a notepad, not a tablet, not a screen, an actual paper notepad with a cardboard cover, the kind his grandfather had used when he was young. His grandfather had kept one in his shirt pocket every day of his working life and had said that there was something important about writing things down by hand, something that typing could not replicate, something about the slowness of it that made you think more carefully about each word. Cole was writing down names. He had the full crew lists from the Dunmore and the Gray Line pulled up on a small screen beside the notepad. There were 87 names on the Dunmore's list. 41 on the Gray Line's. He was writing them all down, one at a time, in the careful handwriting his mother had made him practice when he was 9 years old. He did not know exactly why he was doing it. He had not planned to do it. He had just come to the lounge after the damage control work, sat down, and found himself reaching for the notepad that he always kept in his jacket pocket out of old habit. He supposed he was doing it because it felt wrong for those names to exist only in a database. A database was a correct and necessary thing. But it was also cold, and the people whose names were in it had not been cold. Calvin had been warm and funny and proud of his daughter. Priya had been sharp and competitive at cards and deeply homesick in a way she laughed about but that you could still hear underneath the laughter. They had been specific people, not entries. Somebody needed to write that down somewhere. He kept writing until he had all 128 names. Then he closed the notepad and held it in both hands and sat there for a little while before he got up and went back to his station, because that was where he was needed. On the other side of the galaxy, in the Great Hall of the Verithan Imperial Council, a junior officer stood before 15 of the most powerful beings in the known galaxy and delivered a report that none of them were prepared to hear. He had been rehearsing it during the entire journey back. He had tried many different ways to say it. In the end he had chosen to say it plainly, because there was no version of the truth that was going to feel gentle, and trying to soften it would only make him look like he was afraid of it. He told them the numbers. He told them the human fleet size. He told them what the human weapons had done to the Verithan formation. He told them about the accuracy, the range, the tactical adaptability that no intelligence assessment had predicted. He told them about the 40-second ultimatum and what happened when the clock reached 0. He told them about the surrender. Then, because he believed it was important, he told them the other thing. He said, the human fleet had the capability to destroy every ship in the formation. He had reviewed the battle data carefully during his journey back. There were multiple moments during the engagement when a single coordinated strike could have ended every Verithan vessel present. The humans chose, at each of those moments, not to take that action. They disabled withdrawing ships. They accepted surrender signals. They held their fire when holding their fire was not strategically necessary. The chamber was very quiet. One of the elder council members, a woman who had served on the council for 40 years and had seen many things, asked in a careful voice, "How many ships did we lose in total?" The officer told her. She closed her eyes for a moment. Then she asked how many human ships were lost. He told her that number 2. She opened her eyes. Another council member said what the room was thinking. He said, "They held back. They had us and they held back." The elder council member looked at him and said, "Yes. That means they are not trying to destroy us. That means they are trying to tell us something." The officer was dismissed. The council stayed in session for 6 more hours. Back in the dark, Ambassador Lyrian sat in a small room on the surrendered command vessel and waited. She had sent her message. She had heard nothing back. She did not know if her channel had been received or if it had been filtered or ignored. She sat with her hands folded and her eyes on the floor and waited. When the communication terminal beside her lit up, she moved to it slowly, not letting herself rush, not letting herself hope too much. She sat down and accepted the channel. Admiral Leon Graves looked back at her from the screen. He was a tired man with gray at his temples and eyes that had seen a long day. He looked at her for a moment before either of them spoke. Then he said, "We received your message." She said she did not know what came next. He said neither did he. She said that was terrifying. He said yes. But it was better than the only other option. She said she agreed. He told her that humanity was willing to talk. He said the terms were not soft. Humanity was not going to pretend today had not happened or that the last 60 years had not happened. There would be accountability for Cal-Livan 3 and the other colonies that came before it and after it. There would be real changes, not documents that got filed away. He said the terms left everyone alive and left a door open between their peoples, and that door was the most important thing humanity had built in the last 20 years, more important than any ship or weapon or shield. Lyrian said she would carry the message. She said she did not know if the council would listen. Leon said he understood that. He said, "Do what you can." She said she would. She always had. The channel closed. The room was quiet. Outside the window of her small room, the human fleet floated in the dark like 300 patient stars, holding position, waiting. They had done what they came to do. Now they were doing the harder thing. They were staying. Not to threaten, not to conquer, not to make a point with force. They were staying because the next step, the conversation, the difficult and uncertain and necessary conversation, was the whole reason the fleet had been built in the first place. Not just to win a battle. To make a battle like this the last one. Far behind the fleet, past the wreckage and the quiet dark and the long distance between stars, was a small blue planet that most of the galaxy had never thought about twice. A planet full of people who had kept a secret for 20 years and had finally said what they needed to say. They were not done. They knew they were not done. But they were still there, still standing, still looking outward. They were not afraid.